we do have a policy in this facility that no campaign,
Let's just take it off.
paraphernalia.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Let's just pull that down so that we're not in violation.
Yep, that's great.
Thank you for reminding me of
That's
that.
not hard.
Where's,
Yeah.
all right.
Do you mind if we do a quick mic check, just to make sure?
Sure
the
thing,
mics
yep.
work?
Is that good?
Go ahead and say
Level?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Give me a second.
Tell some jokes, document.
Yeah. All right,
Only
just one
Lena
more
jokes
time,
would
1,
be
2,
good,
3,
you know, unless they're saved.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
All right. Okay.
Very good. Doug Wardlow, running for Attorney General. I'm here with Jeff Johnson and Jim Hagedorn. We just toured the Freeport County Jail. Sheriff Freitag. Sheriff Freitag told us about his operation here, and it's really, it seems to be I think a model for the rest of the state. In particular, the sheriff's cooperation with federal immigration authorities is notable. The fact that they have an agreement with ICE where they take detainees, and it's a flexible agreement, and it's just a model of cooperation, sharing data with the federal government as well to make sure that Minnesotans are safe. And as Attorney General, I want to replicate that model if possible across the state. We need to have more cooperation with ICE, push back against sanctuary city policies, and make sure that dangerous criminals who are illegal aliens are being reported to federal authorities. So that's very important. And then Sheriff Freitag told us his view that as a law enforcement official, it's all about enforcing the law, not pushing any kind of policy. And that's exactly the view we need actually in the Attorney General's office as well. It's a law enforcement position, simply applying the law and enforcing the law that the legislature passes. That's how the Attorney General needs to operate, and that's how I will operate as Attorney General. And I think it's also, we heard a lot about methamphetamine use and how that's on the rise. Methamphetamine is coming across the border from Mexico, but also heroin coming overseas from China. So we have a lot of problems to deal with in terms of enforcing our borders to solve the rising problem we have with methamphetamines and heroin and opioids. So there's a lot of things to work on, and to really deal with those problems, we're going to need to rebuild the criminal law division of the Attorney General's office, which has been eviscerated by the folks that have been in charge of the Attorney General's office for the last couple of decades. So it was a very enlightening tour, and it's wonderful to be here.
Great, well, thank you guys for coming out. I appreciate it. Thank you, Sheriff, for giving us a tour, kind of giving us some background information, which is really helpful. And I think probably all of us have taken tours of other facilities, and a couple things come to mind based upon what we learned from the sheriff and some of his deputies today. Number one, it just reminds me of the importance and the dedication of the people who do this work. And some of them are out there in front of us every day. We see them because they're on the streets, or they're in their patrol cars. But others of them, particularly our corrections officials in our jails and in our prisons, we don't see them out in the public, but they're putting their lives at risk every single day to keep us safe. And to me, that's a really important part of public safety that we sometimes forget. And it seems like, at least in Freeborn County, that's being done well, and we are supporting them, and we have rules that keep them safe. That is not necessarily true at the state level. As I talk to our corrections officials in some of our prisons, at least, they do not feel like the state is supporting them. They do not feel, based upon some of the policy changes that have been made that seem to be more about the comfort of our inmates as opposed to the safety of our employees, that they are being backed up. And I think that's something we have to look at. And I think the example I saw here is actually a good one for us to take to the state. The other thing that struck me today, we talked a bit about the crime problems that are prevalent in Freeborn County, and the opioid crisis and meth seem to be near the top of the list, if not at the top of the list. And as we see that meth is once again rearing its ugly head, and much of it is just coming straight up from Mexico, along with the opioid crisis that's coming from several different places, it does bring up the issue of whether Minnesota is going to be a sanctuary state or not. And then you throw on top of that the fact that I think people are on a bit of heightened alert because of the caravan that we're seeing of thousands of people moving towards the border. We have to make a decision in this state whether we want to be a sanctuary, a safe space for illegal immigrants, including ones that might have criminal records, or whether we don't. Because we're not right now, nor is any state in the upper Midwest. And at least two of our opponents, I'm not sure where Fian is on this one, but certainly my opponent, he's
Yeah, he's right
there.
alongside him.
And so our opponents actually all believe that Minnesota should be a sanctuary state. And as we watch what's happening and we see the meth coming up from Mexico, and we have illegal immigrants in America, they go online and do a little bit of research and say, oh, well, maybe we want to be in Tim Walz's Minnesota because we will be protected from any potential prosecution or detention by ICE. And I don't think that's where we want to be as a state, and I think some of the things we talked about today reinforced that for me. So thank you again, Sheriff, and Jim, maybe you want to say a few
Sure.
words as well.
Before you do, I'm so sorry. I'm
Yep.
still having microphone issues.
That's okay.
Mic check, 1, 2, 3.
Here, I can talk, or if you want to go look.
Yeah, if you could do that, thank
Yep.
you.
Sure.
Oops. All right, go ahead.
Sure, testing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Okay, good, thank you.
We're good?
Okay, all right. Well, just very, very briefly, I really appreciate, Sheriff, the tour of the facility and all the fine work that you and law enforcement here in southern Minnesota are doing. I'm here to support my friends, Jeff and Doug. And over the last year or so, we've crisscrossed southern Minnesota, going to all 21 counties, meeting with law enforcement, either sheriffs, police officers, and others. And they are doing fine work on behalf of the people of southern Minnesota, and our nation. And I think what we have to do is make sure that the politicians don't get in their way. That we don't have policies that are going to hamstring them or make our communities less safe. So from the standpoint of the big policies in Washington that we're going to try to affect, make sure we have secure borders so these drugs aren't pouring into our country. Make sure we have merit-based immigration so we know who is here and that we have folks that are going to assimilate and those types of things. And restore the rule of law. And with that, again, I appreciate the policies of Jeff, Doug. They're fighting for Minnesota. They're fighting for you, and the sheriff and all of them for what they're doing for our communities.
Sheriff, do you want to add anything?
Sure. When we did the tour downstairs, one of the things that I talked about as a Minnesota sheriffs, and there's 87 of us, is it's not a sheriff's job to inject his or her own feelings or emotions into how our laws are already read. Okay, we have to act off of the laws that we have in place. Our job isn't to enforce federal laws. That's why we have federal agents. But we can cooperate with ICE and other federal agencies, maybe U.S. Marshals. We don't have the resources to enforce federal statutes even if we wanted to. But cooperation is key, and Freeborn County does cooperate with ICE, and we always will. One of our ways of cooperating is having this agreement with ICE, where ICE doesn't have detention facilities, we do. And our cooperation with them is they send their ICE detainees to us. We'll hold them for ICE, and we get compensated. To me, that's a good example of cooperation with ICE. The other is we communicate with them on our daily population in our jail. You know, they get to review who we have in our jail, and if there's someone of interest for them, you know, they can act on it. And so we'll always have a good relationship with ICE and the feds. Just to reiterate, I think that sheriffs need to stick with the laws that we have in place, and if we as a state collectively feel that those laws aren't working in our best interest as a state, then it's time for the state to change the laws to something that is what the people want. But until then, we need to take our emotions out of, you know, the enforcement of laws and just follow what the statute says. That's our duty and that's our obligation as sheriffs.
Question for you.
Yeah.
Okay, so what do you think is the biggest issue right now locally that you would like to see a little bit more cooperation from the state level, the governor's office, or you know the national level? What kind of problem do you want to see? Is it funding? Kind of talk to that a little bit.
You know, we can always use more funding, and we have just an infinite number of places where we could increase our funding if we had the ability. You know, when we were doing the tour downstairs, I had mentioned that you know, we hear about the epidemic of mental illness sweeping our country. Do we need funding for that? Absolutely. We have people who end up in our facility, in our detention center, who have no business being there. That is not the right place for them. But as a state, we're lacking other resources to use. So it'd be nice if we had additional funding for that. We've got our opioid epidemic. Meth has never even tapered off. And so our drug task force currently has 4 agents. If I could go to 8 agents, I would love that, and all 8 of them would be busy. So, you know, that would take additional funding from the state. But currently that's not in the works. But, you know, it's drugs, of course, is our #1 problem. The drugs spawns off so many other crimes, you know, your burglaries, home invasions. Houses get burglarized just to raid the medicine cabinet to see what that home has for drugs. You know, and if they find guns along the way and find cash inside the house, that's gone too, and that becomes a problem later on as well. So, you know, we've got a whole host of areas that if we had more money, more personnel, more resources, we'd put it all to good use.
Sheriff, how many people do you employ specifically to enforce the ICE agreement you have? Do you have any statistics on that?
Well, our entire detention center is in contact with ICE detainees. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, how many employees do you have down there? Yes.
Well, we've got 40 total in the detention center, including the jail administrator. We have 1 ICE coordinator, and we have, let's see, 4 transport deputies where all they do is run their transport vans. So, you know, roughly 44 total.
I have a question for Mr. Johnson. You talked about the caravan approaching the border full of immigrants. Can you talk about some of the concerns that Minnesotans have right now with regards to maybe not just immigration, but also being a sanctuary city, and just what are some of the concerns that you've heard from people
Sure.
that you would like to address and perhaps change?
Yeah, so I mean, we're not a sanctuary state, obviously, right now, but our opponents want us to become a sanctuary state. And the concern that I hear from people is that, you know, right now in Minnesota, we're having trouble, you know, taking care of people who are here already, who need help, whether it's our most vulnerable citizens. I look at what we pay our group home workers, and it's sad. Whether it is, you know, what the sheriff just talked about, are we doing everything we need to do to make sure those who have mental illness aren't in our jails but are actually getting treatment or drug treatment? So there is so much right now where I believe government isn't doing a great job of focusing to take care of our most vulnerable citizens. And if we are now going to essentially become a magnet for illegal immigrants, many of whom are going to need services or want services as well, that means even fewer Minnesotans who are already here are going to see the benefits of the taxes that we all pay in. So to me, that is a major concern. I think there are also safety concerns because, you know, there are probably many people in that caravan who are just desperately trying to find a better life. I have no doubt about that. I also believe there are probably some people in that caravan who wouldn't be the greatest citizens in Minnesota. They may have some sort of background that we don't want here. And I think the fact that, you know, if they come up here and we have no way of vetting them because they're just crossing the border and then coming to Minnesota because we're going to protect them from ICE, I don't think that's what most Minnesotans are looking for.
President Trump has said that he would support using the military to protect the border against these people, I believe. Would you support that too, doing that?
Well, so I would have no control over the federal
Right,
military,
yeah.
obviously, but if there was a request for the National Guard, I would consult with my leaders of the National Guard as the commander of the National Guard, and you know, I would be open to that. To me, that seems like something that would be an appropriate use of the National Guard. I actually happen to believe that we should try to keep the National Guard inside the country rather than sending them overseas. But I wouldn't make that decision myself. I would consult with the people who actually live that.
Circling back to mental health briefly, as governor, what would you like to see done specifically with helping the mental health crisis and getting those people the help they need?
Well, it's all about, it's really two things. It's all about treatment, but it's also about diagnosing it to sometimes you have people who don't, might have mental health issues, but they might not. It just might be who they are. And so, I think we have to make sure that we are diagnosing it. And this is not just an issue with respect to, mentally ill people committing crimes and being in the jails. We're seeing it a lot with our kids right now too. And so I think you start with that early to make sure that we are screening for mental health issues, and then it's treatment. And I talk a lot about the fact that I think government overall spends too much money. We've seen just massive increases in spending and taxes the last 8 years. But that doesn't mean there aren't certain areas where we probably should be doing a better job and possibly spending more. And this would be one of them. I think both drug treatment and mental health treatment are really important public safety issues. And so it might mean bolstering somewhat what the state is already providing in these areas. And then using programs that are proving that they actually work and help people. Because we do have some programs, especially in drug treatment, that don't seem to be doing much, but we continue to fund them. Let's measure these programs, figure out which ones are actually helping people, and fund those. Any other questions for any of us?
I guess a question for Mr. Hagedorn quick.
Yes, ma'am.
Would you mind commenting on the current, we just had Joe Biden today, and what celebrity was it that got a bomb threat this
Sure.
morning? De Niro, Robert De Niro.
Mhm.
Can you talk to just that whole rhetoric going on in violence right now within the campaign season, and what you kind of take away from that?
Yeah, I think I can speak for everyone in saying that we don't condone any type of rhetoric that's trying, getting people, prompting them into violent actions. It's let's discuss the issues. Let's have adult conversations back and forth. Let's go to the ballot box and settle it there. And we wish safety upon everyone. When my opponent and I see each other, we usually wish each other safe travels, and I think all of us would go along with that with our opponents. And I have one thing on the mental illness deal. You bring up very good points, but and speaking with the sheriff and other law enforcement across the district, and sheriff, correct me if I'm wrong, but when you or anyone could be at the hospital, someone who you think is in that category, sometimes you have to put them in an ambulance. An officer might have to go along, go all the way up to like Fergus Falls or someplace, way away, might have to stay overnight. You're losing the use of that officer for a day or two. It's driving up your costs. That's tough on the community, isn't it? Tough on your work.
It's tough on my budget and my personal, to spend that much time on something. If we had a different avenue for that person, for a proper treatment, or a place for that person to, get better, but having my deputies deal with that person for sometimes several days.
Sure.
Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, and I think you've addressed some of these things in the past. Do we need more facilities for
Yeah.
folks like that?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
And that's what I'm getting at. We flat out need facilities.
Yeah, we're low on mental health beds in Minnesota. There's no way around that. And that is just a simple cost question. Are we willing to spend money on that as a state and as a community because we decided that that's important or not? And right now we are not doing that adequately. And when I talk about, we've seen these massive spending increases, but we're still not taking care of our most vulnerable citizens well in Minnesota. And that's because we just throw money at everything rather than saying what's most important. And this would be a great example of people who need help, and we're not doing it very well in the state. All right, anything else? You want to pretend like you're talking so she can get a different angle?
I can actually ask you one question
Sure.
here. So your opponent Keith Ellison has talked with us about the current housing crisis. Are you guys seeing a affordable housing lack here too, or is that mostly a Rochester Olmsted County?
I don't think we have a crisis here. I know houses are going fairly quickly, and there's a certain price range. I'm not a real estate agent, But I know there's some houses in a price range that are disappearing fairly quickly, but I've never heard it described as a crisis.
Okay, so, sorry we're veering off a little bit, but I'm just curious, what as Attorney General can you do to address that sort of issue?
Well, that is really more of a policy question. It's best for the legislature to determine how best to address housing issues, and the Attorney General's role is to enforce the law that the legislature passes. There are things that the Attorney General is empowered to do, looking at lending practices, making sure that everything's above board, fighting consumer fraud that can really help people afford housing perhaps in certain situations. But it's really just about enforcing the consumer fraud laws and other kinds of laws that are on the books that might help people in situations like that.
Yeah, I was surprised to hear him talk to what he really wants to do as Attorney General, because you think that's a question for these guys, but.
Right.
I was
He really wants to,
surprised.
it seems that he wants to push a policy agenda through the Attorney General's office and the courts, which is not appropriate given the separation of powers.
Okay, got it, thank you.
Great.
All right, thanks, everybody.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate you coming out.
Very nice.
Sheriff, thanks again.
Yeah.
That was wonderful.
Thank
Good
you.
luck to you. We all have your back.
And you guys too. I wish you all luck.
Thanks.
I want you guys
Thank
to
you.
be good luck.
Yeah, I really appreciate this.
Okay, you're welcome.
Thank you.